Hi everyone. So we might make a start. I think most people have joined us now. My name is Megan Hammersley. I'm a researcher at Early Start in the Food and Movement research team, and I'm also an accredited practicing dietitian. And my research is mostly focused on supporting and promoting healthy lifestyles for young children, and I mostly work with parents. And I'm also joined tonight by Early Start researcher Myrto Mavilidi, who is an educational psychologist. So before we go any further tonight, I'd just like to firstly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the University of Wollongong is situated, the Five Islands people. We pay our respects to Aboriginal elders, past and present, who are the knowledge holders and teachers. We acknowledge their continued spiritual and cultural connection to country. As we share knowledge, teaching, learning and research within the university, we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. So tonight, firstly, we'll be giving a brief overview of childhood brain development, and then I'll be talking about the relationship between food intake and learning and cognition. And after that, I'll hand over to Myrto, and she'll be talking about the relationships between physical activity and sleep and cognition and learning. If you have any questions along the way, please feel free to type these in the chat function, and then we'll do our very best to answer them for you at the end of the session. So to start off, I'll talk a little bit about child brain development, as we'll be referring to this later on. As we all know, the brain is our control centre for the whole body. It controls our behaviour and psychological functioning, and it's very complex, and also it develops a lot differently to the rest of the body. A child's brain development is influenced by both their genes and also by their surrounding environment. A newborn baby is born with all of the neurons or brain cells that they'll have for the rest of their life. However, at this stage, there aren't yet all of the connections that are needed to make the brain do all it needs to do. And these brain connections, which are also known as synapses, help us to move, think, and communicate. And the early childhood period is a really critical time to start to develop those connections. In fact, 1 million new synapses are created every second. So this is more than any other stage of life. And these brain connections are developed through a child's everyday experiences and interactions. So ensuring adequate care and stimulation in these crucial early years is really important for ensuring a good foundation. So in the first 5 years, the brain develops more than any other time, and development at this stage can have lasting effects. At birth, a baby's brain is about a quarter of the size of an adult brain. It then grows to double its size within the first year. By the age of 3, it's 80% grown, and then by the age of 5, it's 90% grown. I'll now just talk very briefly about the main functions of the different parts of the brain. So the central brain, that is the midbrain, is the only part that's well developed at birth, and this controls vital reflexes like breathing and sleeping. The cerebral cortex is the largest part of the brain, which is underdeveloped at birth. It's involved with higher forms of intelligence, perception, and also voluntary behaviour. And the cortex takes shape under environmental influences. The brain needs constant stimulation to develop properly, and lack of stimulation can lead to serious side effects. So this highlights the importance of early care and stimulation. The brain is the last organ to reach maturation in the body, and that happens between the ages of 25 to 30. So it takes quite a significant amount of time to develop. And the frontal lobe is the last to connect. And you can see this highlighted in the image where the adolescent or teen brain is still under development. This is the area that controls executive functions, judgment, impulse control, decision-making, and also empathy. It's very important that positive habits are modelled and strengthened at this stage of development. I'll also just mention a couple of definitions of terms that we'll be referring to in our talk tonight. So firstly, cognition refers to the mental structures, operations, and processes related to thinking, learning, memory, and problem solving. And learning is a relatively permanent change of behaviour brought about by practice or experience. It includes an acquired set of knowledge, abilities, skills, behaviours, and attitudes. So now moving on to the effect of lifestyle factors on learning and cognition. So we know that young children learn new knowledge, behaviours and skills more than any other stage of life. And we also know that social skills and academic achievement can have a lasting impact in later life. While we've known for many years that lifestyle factors such as dietary intake, physical activity and sleep impact on a child's health and well-being, more and more research now is highlighting the importance of these factors for learning as well. Knowing that there's a relationship between diet and physical functioning, it makes sense that diet and physical activity can affect cognitive function and learning abilities. This is a growing area of research, and while we'll explore some of the studies that have been done tonight, there's still a lot more that we need to learn about this area. This slide shows a model of what can contribute to a child's cognitive learning and other developmental outcomes. You'll see that the inner circle represents the child themselves, where their own physiology is affected by the nutrients and energy from the food that they eat, and the feelings of hunger or tiredness that might affect their cognitive and learning processes. Then in the next circle, you'll see that the lifestyle factors of dietary intake, physical activity and sleeping habits, which can affect on the child's physiology. And the outermost circle refers to the child's wider environment. So this includes things in the child's home environment, like socioeconomic characteristics, their access to resources, routines and practices at home, and also their school or early childhood education and care experiences. So this might be access to outdoor play spaces, practices to encourage children to be active, and also their access to healthy foods. Now I'll move on to talk about what we know about the relationship between dietary intake, learning, cognition, and behaviour. Firstly, it's certain that adequate nutrition is essential for healthy brain development. Nutrition is especially important in early life as it lays the foundations for the development of cognitive motor and also socio-emotional skills. And while this is an ongoing area of research, it seems clear that nutritional deficiencies can impact on brain development and cognition. General malnutrition in the first months of a child's life can lead to lifelong impacts on both brain development and learning abilities. This slide shows some nutrients which are important for child brain development and processes. So low intake of some of these nutrients can therefore cause disruption to important brain development and function. Now, for most children in Australia, these needs are able to be met through a healthy diet, which includes a wide range of foods which are abundant in our food supply. But there are special situations such as some medical conditions that might call for supplementation, but this is best discussed with a doctor or dietitian. So while levels of micronutrient intake in Australia are quite good, if we look at the situation worldwide, there are deficiencies in iron, zinc and iodine. We know that 25% of the world's population has iron deficiency anemia, and 33% are deficient in zinc. So usually in Australia, these intakes are quite reasonable, but it's also important to note that children who consume more discretionary foods, which are low in these key nutrients and less of the core food groups, may be at risk of low intake of these nutrients. Now, the first nutrient that I'm going to discuss is omega-3, which is a type of polyunsaturated fatty acid. Now, evidence regarding polyunsaturated fats and cognition and academic achievement is still quite limited. However, we do know that these fats are essential for normal brain development. So it's plausible that intake could also be related to better cognition. The research that has been done indicates that a higher intake of polyunsaturated fats and a lower intake of saturated fats has been associated with better cognitive function and academic achievement. Polyunsaturated fats have also been related to better short-term memory, but overall the results of the different studies are quite mixed. There are different types of omega-3 fatty acids. So DHA and EPA, you may have heard of, come from sources like fish sources like sardines, salmon and tuna. And ALA comes from plant sources like walnuts, some seeds, and canola and soybean oils. Some studies have found that EPA and DHA levels have been associated with outcomes like working memory and reading performance, whereas other studies haven't found these outcomes. So again, a bit mixed. Some studies have found that there's been a negative relationship between saturated and trans fatty acid intake and working memory. So the more saturated fat that's eaten, the worse working memory is. Research is still continuing in this area, and these studies that have been done have mostly been what we call cross-sectional, which means that the measures are taken at a point in time and compared. So causation hasn't yet been determined. Omega-3 fatty acid intake in children at the moment in Australia is actually quite low. So while I said on the previous slide that intakes are quite good, for this it's probably the poorest. So some children may benefit from eating more foods which are high in omega-3. So only around half of children are getting enough omega-3 at the moment. So with iron, there's been more than 50 studies which have been done on iron and brain development. And it's fairly clear that prevention of iron deficiency is the key. Deficiency of iron can lead to cognitive and motor impacts, as well as fatigue, which can then impact on cognition and learning. When iron is deficient, it's also directed away from the brain, because the priority of the body is to make red blood cells. And the effects of iron deficiency can also be long-lasting, and it can negatively affect academic performance. So it's much better to have optimal levels from the start than to try and correct a deficiency. However, just a note of caution, excessive intake can actually lead to adverse neurodevelopmental outcomes. So it's really important that iron supplements are only taken if absolutely needed, and they should be taken under medical supervision. So this is a general rule with most nutrients. As a nutrient that can be helpful in the right amounts can actually be toxic at high levels. There are meat and non-meat sources of iron. The meat sources are generally better absorbed, and the redder the meat, the higher the iron content. Zinc is also important for brain function. There are mixed studies on the effect of zinc on child cognition and motor development, but some individual studies suggest that there are beneficial outcomes when zinc deficiency is prevented in infancy. It's thought that zinc deficiency can affect learning, attention, memory, and also mood as well. Iodine is critical for normal brain function. So supplementation for women in early pregnancy has been shown to result in better cognitive outcomes in children, whereas deficiency can lead to poorer learning, memory, and increased anxiety. And iodine has actually become lower in Australian diets in recent years, and that's due to a couple of reasons. Firstly, due to soil depletion of iodine in some areas, And it's also been reduced as the dairy industry used to use sanitation products that contained iodine. So dairy used to be a good source of iodine, and it isn't so much anymore. But all bread is now fortified with iodine because it was recognised that that the food supply was sort of dwindling. So so that makes bread a good source now. Carotenoids are pigments that give foods their colour. The carotenoids lutein and zeaxanthin have been linked to higher cognitive test results. And lutein, which is the carotenoid found mainly in green vegetables like asparagus, kale, spinach and broccoli, has been related to executive function, language, learning and also memory. With the B vitamin group, thiamine is particularly important for brain function, and folate and vitamin B12 intake have been associated with academic performance. As well as iodine, bread is also fortified with thiamine and folic acid. Vitamin B12 is quite plentiful in our food supply through foods of animal origin, including milk and eggs. However, people who follow a vegan eating pattern need to be mindful of their intake. There are some meat alternatives that are fortified with B12, but a supplement may be required sometimes. So overall, research shows that these individual nutrients may play a role in cognition and learning. The strongest evidence exists for iron, zinc and iodine in terms of avoiding or treating deficiencies. However, research for the other nutrients has mostly been cross-sectional. So like I touched on before, this means that the dietary measurements and cognitive academic measurements are taken at one point in time, and then those relationships are looked at. So this doesn't prove causation. There may be other factors that are involved that haven't been looked at in those studies. So what's needed is long-term, well-designed studies that look at these relationships over time, and trials that involve a control group to investigate you know, whether these nutrients are provided or not, whether that makes a difference. So moving on from looking at specific nutrients, studies that have looked at different food groups have had some interesting findings as well. A higher intake of fish has been linked to better cognition and academic achievement in a few studies. So this is possibly because of the omega-3 content of the fish, as I mentioned previously. One study has found that consumption of fruit, particularly berries, was associated with better academic achievement in adolescents. Other studies have found relationships between vegetable intake and academic achievement. And then on the flip side, low fruit intake and low berry intake and low intake of vegetables and fibre grains and a high intake of red meat has been associated with poorer cognition in school-age children. Other studies have found that high intake of soft drinks and other sweetened drinks is also related to poorer academic achievement. When we're looking at dietary intake, though, it's sometimes really difficult to study specific nutrients and foods because they don't occur in our diet in isolation as we eat combinations of all different types of foods and nutrients. There are a number of dietary sources that have been, dietary scores, that have been developed and used in some studies which look at different combinations of foods that are consumed. And some studies have shown that a dietary pattern which is high in vegetables, fruit and home prepared foods in the early years has been associated with better cognitive function later on. So it was a sort of long-term study which sort of has a bit more evidence than those, you know, cross-sectional studies that just take measurements at one point in time. And dietary patterns which are high in fast foods, red meat, soft drinks, fried and refined foods have been associated with poorer cognitive function. Several studies have been done on relationships between the consumption of breakfast and cognition and learning. I'm sure we've all heard breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and in some ways it is. So these studies have generally found that compared with skipping breakfast, children who consume breakfast have improved attention, cognition, and academic performance. So it's thought that the distraction of hunger may mean that children miss out on, or they may not understand key information presented, or that their learning experience or memories of the learning are limited and not well retained. It must be noted, though, that there also could be other influences that weren't included in these studies. So, for example, children who eat breakfast might also have better parent support, for example, and this may be what is making the difference. So although there hasn't been a lot of research on what type of breakfast is best, it does seem that foods with a lower glycemic index might be better. If you haven't heard of glycemic index, as you probably know, all carbohydrate foods break down to glucose in our body, and glucose is the preferred source of energy for the brain. But because glucose can't be stored, it's important that the brain has a steady supply. Children also need a more continuous supply of glucose than what adults do. And so it's important that they stay fueled and have longer lasting energy foods that are going to give them more sustained glucose throughout the day. Different carbohydrate foods break down to glucose at different rates, and levels of glucose can fluctuate according to the intake of different carbohydrate foods. The major source of carbohydrate foods are breads and cereals, and they're also found in fruits, some vegetables, and dairy foods. So glycemic index is the ranking of carbohydrate foods according to their effect on blood glucose, or how fast they break down. This glucose release not only depends on the type of carbohydrate food, but also the amount. And we know that high glycemic index foods cause large fluctuations in blood glucose levels. And you can see from the image at the bottom of the slide that with high glycemic index foods, there's a fast release of glucose into the blood, which then fairly quickly drops compared to a food with a lower glycemic index, which rises at a slower rate and is more sustained over time. It's been found that these large fluctuations might affect a number of brain functions, such as short-term memory. So overall, it's been found that the glycemic index of breakfast can influence a child's ability to focus and learn at school. So this may also be to do with the feelings of hunger that arise after eating a high glycemic index breakfast, which might be distracting the child from their schoolwork. So some examples of lower glycemic index breakfast foods are wholemeal or whole grain bread as opposed to white bread, and whole wheat cereals or oats instead of sugary cereals. Milk and most fruits also break down slowly in the body. Because these foods break down slower, they give children more sustained energy compared to more processed high sugar foods, which break down very quickly and leave children hungry shortly after and leave them with that energy slump. So glycemic index foods, not always, but generally the higher the amount of fibre in a food, in a carbohydrate food, the lower the glycemic index is going to be. And things like fat and also protein will also lower the glycemic index of the meal. So from a general health perspective, children who eat breakfast are also more likely to get the right amount of nutrients as well and fibre, and they're also more likely to be a healthy weight. So relatively few studies have looked at whether nutrition during early childhood is associated with the development of childhood behavioural problems. Some animal research has found that low intake of key nutrients can increase aggressive behaviour. And there are a limited number of human studies which also suggest similar findings. The nutrients that have been observed in these studies include omega-3, where a lack of intake has been linked to behavioural problems. And overall malnutrition during the early years of life has been associated with more externalising behaviours in later childhood, like aggression or hyperactivity. And other studies have shown some similar findings in relation to other behavioural problems and social skills. So on the whole, it seems that children who have a healthy, energy-dense diet are less likely to have antisocial behaviour, whereas malnutrition appears to be associated with various conduct problems, both during childhood and later on in life. There are also other factors such as genetics and family environment factors which come into play with child behaviour. But a recent twin study has found that twins with poorer eating habits compared to their co-twin are more likely to experience behavioural problems. So it seems that it's not just genetics and the family environment that's associated with behaviour, but diet can also be a factor. So clearly there's much more research to be done in this area, but it does appear that dietary intake might have an influence on child behaviour. Specifically in regard to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD, there's much that's unknown about the cause. Both genetic and environmental factors are thought to be involved. And almost all dietary research has been focused on three key areas. So firstly, what's called the few foods diet. Secondly, polyunsaturated fatty acid supplementation, mainly omega-3, and also the elimination of artificial food colorings. So a recent review of different studies found that there's convincing evidence for the effect of the few foods diet on ADHD. So few foods diets are a method to identify children who are diet sensitive, and then the end treatment is an individually tailored diet which is worked out for the child after they undertake some challenges of different foods. So the highly restrictive phase of the diet should only be followed for the short term, and it starts off with some very limited foods like pear, potato, rice and chicken, and then it's followed by a series of food challenges. It can be burdensome on families and should only be undertaken under medical supervision. There was a much smaller effect found for polyunsaturated fatty acid supplementation, and they reported that it was unlikely to have a meaningful, to be a meaningful treatment, but there may be some individual variations there. So there's some continuing research in that area. In regard to artificial food colorings, and that's probably been, very publicised, I guess, over the years, the authors suggested that further research has been done. So there have been some studies done, but it's been inconclusive. So more studies need to be done. And there's also been much talk and publicity over the years about the association of sugar and ADHD, but studies have shown really conflicting results. So a recent review of 7 studies in primary age children found that there was an association between overall sugar intake and in particular sugar sweetened beverages and symptoms of ADHD. However, there was a lot of variation between the studies that were included, and they concluded again that more studies are needed to confirm whether there is an effect of sugar on ADHD. But in the meantime, we should do our best to minimise sugar and sugary drinks from a health perspective anyway, of course. So to sum up this section on eating for the learner-friendly home, it's suggested to offer a wide variety of nutrient-dense foods for our children, and this should include some good protein sources with plenty of fish and seafood and a moderate amount of lean meat and other sources of iron, but not too much red meat. So around 2 fish meals and 3 red meat meals a week or iron-rich high-protein alternatives are recommended. Offering plenty of vegetables and fruit, including a good variety, including some of those green vegetables and berries, which some of those studies suggest may be beneficial. Offering mostly whole grain breads and cereals, which are higher in fibre, generally more filling and having that lower glycemic index. Limiting foods that are high in saturated fat and sugar sweetened drinks, and ensuring a healthy breakfast that's going to sustain children until break time. So thanks so much for listening, everyone. We might just take a short 5-minute break now, and then I'll hand over to Myrto to talk about physical activity and sleep. So we will see you soon.
Welcome back, everyone. In this part, we're going to talk about physical activity, learning, cognition, and behavior in children. To begin with, let's define what physical activity is. Physical activity includes any body movement that uses energy beyond resting. In young children, this can be walking, crawling, running, jumping, climbing, and basically any similar activity that can be done indoors or outdoors. In 2019, the World Health Organization released some 24-hour movement guidelines that they have specific recommendations for physical activity, sedentary time, and screen time. These recommendations vary based on children's age. So for infants up to 1 year, it is recommended that children spend up to 30 minutes per day in physical activity. That includes tummy time, interactive floor-based play. And they should limit the time they spend in sedentary time, like time sitting in prams or strollers or high chairs, up to an hour. And there is no recommended use of screen time. For infants 1 to 2 years, it's recommended that they spend 180 minutes in various physical activities per day. And they still should limit the sedentary time to up to an hour at a time. In terms of screen time, 1-year-olds should have no exposure to screen time, while 2 years old, they should not spend more than an hour per day on screen time. For preschoolers 3 to 5 years, it's recommended to spend 180 minutes in physical activity of various intensities and 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. Sedentary time, again, shouldn't be more than an hour at a time, and screen time should be also less than an hour per day. And finally, for children and adolescents 5 to 17 years, it's recommended to spend 60 minutes of physical activity of moderate and vigorous intensity. Or 3 times per week, it's recommended to spend in vigorous physical activity. Sedentary time and screen time, it should be limited to as minimum as possible. It is important here to emphasize that when we are referring to screen time, we mean recreational activities, activities that children do for fun, and that does not include educational activities. Now let's give some examples of moderate to vigorous and vigorous physical activity. So moderate to vigorous physical activity can be brisk walking, cycling, playing ball games, swimming, or dancing. While vigorous physical activity includes running, swimming fast, skipping rope, riding bike fast or on heels, and playing sports. Now, physical activity in young children up to 5 years has been shown to improve motor development, fitness, bone and skeletal health, and cognitive and psychosocial health. For the rest of the presentation, we will focus on this last part, cognitive and psychosocial benefits in children arising from physical activity. Physical activity has been shown to improve school engagement, academic achievement, executive function and metacognition, and mental health. So now I will explain each of these factors separately. Physical activity helps children and students to stay more concentrated on the requirements of the learning task during class time and be more actively engaged in learning. So children who spend a lot of time in physical activity, they experience more positive emotions. We see increased lesson enjoyment and more positive attitudes towards learning. Children are also better self-regulated learners, so they have increased motivation, they use a selection of strategies and problem-solving skills. 2 6-week programs that integrate physically active lessons during mathematics and English learning in primary school students in New South Wales showed an increase on children's on-task behavior and decrease of activities not related to learning, such as fidgeting, chatting, and staring into space. That was when the physically active groups were compared to children who followed a traditional curriculum. So teachers had the option to do the lesson inside or outside the class. Examples of activities include jumping and running on hopscotch. So trying jumping or hopping on randomly placed letter boxes where children have to create new words and also try to spell the words. We have running and walking on drill ladders while counting, jumps to solve multiplication problems, skipping with a rope, performing squats, push-ups while spelling. These studies also found that students were more positive about mathematics and English, and they were more enthusiastic to come to the class and to the lessons. They usually said they are going to do fun maths. Now, regular participation in physical activity can also be linked with improvements in academic achievement, and in particular, language, reading, and mathematics. A study in preschool children in which they have to learn action words from a foreign language while performing the same actions, for example, dance or jump for the relevant words, found increased memory gains after 4 weeks. Similar learning gains in preschool children were found during learning of counting skills, number estimation task, which is here's number 1 and here's number 3. Where would you place number 2? And magnitude comparison. So is number 3 or number 5 bigger? So when children had to run sideways on a number line, and they had the option to run forward when the numbers were increasing or walk backwards when numbers were decreasing. I'll show you a picture later on this study. In addition, Year 3 students from Sydney had improved their multiplication skills when the lessons were conducted in the playground and included physical activity, compared to regular seated classrooms. Improvements in general numeracy assessed by NAPLAN scores were also observed in both groups. And finally, a 6-month after-school program, including playing sports such as basketball, baseball, or rugby, showed improvements on primary school students' academic scores. Now, before we move on the benefits of physical activity on cognition, let's take a step back and trying to introduce what we mean with the term executive function. What are some of the qualities that children need to have in order to be successful? Qualities that are key to success are creativity, flexibility, self-control, and discipline. Children will need to think creatively to devise solutions never considered before. They will need working memory to mentally work with data and see new connections in elements. They will also need flexibility to appreciate different perspectives and take advantage of serendipity, and self-control to resist temptations and avoid doing something they would regret. All of those qualities are linked to executive functions, the cognitive control functions needed when you need to concentrate and think rather than acting on your initial impulse. So core executive functions include cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to easily and quickly switch perspectives or focus of attention. Inhibition, which is the ability to stay focused and resist temptation. And working memory, which is the ability to hold information while mentally working on it. Now, children aren't born with these skills, but they have the potential to grow them. Executive functions continue to grow and mature throughout childhood, adolescence, and into the adult years. However, as you can see from this red circle, the early years is the time that you can see the steepest line, which means the most rapid progression. That makes us believe that executive function, that the early year is the most critical period for the development of executive function. Now, we really need to target to train and practice this set of skills with specific cognitive activities in order to improve them. Executive functions can predict math and reading competence throughout all school years. To improve school readiness and academic success, targeting executive function is crucial. Executive functions remain critical for success throughout our life, in career, marriage, and for positive and mental health. Research has shown that children with worse self-control, so with less persistence, more impulsivity, and poorer attention regulation at ages 3 to 11, tend to have worse health, earn less, and commit more crimes 30 years later than those children with better self-control. Now, coming back to the physical activity component, physical activity can help cognition and metacognition. And when we say metacognition, we're talking about our ability to understand and control our own learning. So, physical activity can improve core executive functions, working memory, inhibition, cognitive flexibility, as we explained just in the previous slides. Higher level executive functions, so planning, abstract reasoning, problem solving, creativity. Non-executive functions, so non-verbal ability, spatial ability, and decision making, and also cognitive life skills, self-awareness of goal setting, problem solving, and positive thinking. Let's give some examples. A 6-week program in kindergarten children improved their cognitive flexibility when they were engaged in combined physical and cognitive gains. For example, when a predefined lyric is sung in a song, children interrupt fast walking with a frog hop or lie down and get up as quickly as they could. Children had to copy a movement shown in a card, for example, jumping jack or bouncing back and forth, only if the card shown before was different. Another example is a 4-month program with physical education lessons conducted 4 times per week with high intensity of physical activity in adolescents. Improvements were found on non-verbal ability and verbal ability, abstract reasoning, spatial and numerical ability in the adolescents that they were part of these enhanced physical education lessons, compared to the ones that they followed regular physical education lessons that they had lower intensity and they were conducting only twice a week compared to 4 weeks for the enhanced physical education lessons. Now, regular participation in physical activity can also lead to reduction in anxiety, in some improvements in self-esteem and well-being, and there is some initial evidence that it can also reduce depression. So the findings on depression are still not that robust. There are some initial indications, but they also seem promising. This evidence is mostly seen in adolescent population, because this is the age group that mental health problems may arise rapidly. Research has shown that physical activity level is significantly associated with adolescents' mental well-being, self-efficacy, and resilience. Increased physical activity is associated with fewer peer problems in children, both boys and girls aged around 7 to 11 years. So for each additional 15 minutes in moderate to vigorous physical activity, peer problems decreased in boys. For girls, light physical activity was associated with decreased peer problems. For example, a 14-week program in adolescents that there were year 12 students involving 2 sessions of physical activity per week lasting 8 to 20 minutes, including a combination of aerobic, shuttle runs, jumping jacks, and dance sequences, and bodyweight resistance exercises, so push-ups and squat jumps, found improvements on adolescents' stress levels when they measured their hair cortisol. It is important to note that the effects were really strong for adolescents who were obese or overweight, or those with poor mental health. Based on a review of studies we recently did, we found that there is a number of factors that may affect engagement and participation in physical activities. For example, it's important whether physical activity takes place as a group or individually, whether it takes place at home, at the park, or at preschool. The intensity of physical activity, so how light or hard the activity is, and even if there is music accompanying the activity, or is the activity done without. And you can think of yourselves examples of running, if you feel more engaged and motivated running with music or without, with company or alone, or in what context. So the context seems to be an important factor that affects our engagement and participation to physical activity. Now, these factors that I mentioned before, so context, they also influence in turn the physical effort we put, but also the cognitive engagement we show. So this is the cognitive effort. Are we trying hard enough? Are we creative? What strategies do we engage? How happy, energized, or motivated we feel after exercise or during exercise. Now, in the last 8 years, my research is focusing on the combined benefits of integrating motor with cognitive tasks in children. So we can apply simple, short, daily activities at home or in the school environment, where we can combine physical activity with learning. Active learning consists of physically active lessons and movement breaks. So you can see some examples from my own record using physical activities at preschools while learning numbers and learning geography. So the first picture with the numbers is the study that I talked to you before, that children could run forward when numbers were increasing, or they could walk backwards when numbers were decreasing. For cognitively engaging physical activity, it is important to set some rules, train children on quickly changing the rules while applying new ones. For example, we can use the common game Simon Says, and then add some physical activities included in that. Simon says to run backwards. Simon says to jump. And we keep changing what Simon says. Another example is I can say, okay, when I say go to the mountain, you have to go left. When I say go to the ocean, you have to go right. And when I say scrub the deck, you have to do 5 star jumps or push-ups. Other ideas include asking children to perform physical activities during storytelling. For example, it could relate to book characters and trying to cope with their movements. And the last part, we're going to talk about sleep, learning, cognition, and behavior in children. As I mentioned before, the 24-hour movement guidelines include also recommendation for sleep behaviors in children, which also vary based on the age group. So for infants up to 3 months, it's recommended to sleep 4 to 17 hours, including naps. For infants 4 to 11 months, it's included to sleep 12 to 16 hours, including naps. For toddlers 1 to 2 years, they should sleep 11 to 14 hours. Preschoolers, it's recommended to sleep 10 to 13 hours, and that may contain nap. And children, 5 to 13 years, they can sleep 9 to 11 hours, while adolescents 14 to 17 years, it's recommended to sleep 8 to 10 hours. Now, sleep is essential for brain development, learning, and memory. It is also important for physical and mental well-being, cognitive function, language, as well as social and emotional function. Sleep duration and quality have been linked to all three aspects of executive functions, so working memory, inhibition, cognitive flexibility. Partial sleep deprivation or reduced and disturbed sleep have been associated with impaired working memory, impaired inhibition, and cognitive flexibility. And this has been seen mostly in adolescents. In contrast, increased sleep can improve working memory and inhibitory control. Studies have shown that as little as 5 minutes of additional sleep per night can have a positive impact on adolescents who are sleep deprived. In general, we can conclude that sleep tends to affect more complex cognitive functions than general abilities. Reducing sleep by just half an hour a night for 4 nights can reduce the working memory of school-aged children. Some evidence also suggests that short sleeping is associated with poorer academic performance in children. A recent review of studies found that sleep duration, quality, and daytime sleepiness affect school performance of younger children much more than older children. Shorter sleep duration has also been associated with behavior problems at school entry. And finally, poor sleep is also tightly linked with diet, nutrition, and physical activity, with higher risk for overweight and obesity, unhealthy eating patterns such as energy-dense fast food and sweet foods. Children who are staying up later at night are more likely to snacking or unhealthy foods, putting them at higher risk of overweight. Now, what are some key home messages from today's presentation? I know it can be very hard, sometimes or many times, but it's important to maintain a consistent bedtime and wake-up time, because this is the only way to obtain healthy sleeping habits that also affect behavior, diet, and learning. We should also try to avoid screens 1 hour before bed and keep screens out of our children's bedrooms. And lastly, as the Roman poet Juvenal said, we need to ensure we have a healthy mind in a healthy body. So we need to make sure that our children eat a variety of food, they sleep well, and that includes 10 to 13 hours per day. This is the recommendation for preschool children, but also they exercise regularly, so at least an hour per day. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions.